Let's open our Bibles tonight to Genesis chapter 30. So chapter 30. Somebody asked today, how's the building situation going with our church? Everything's at the city. The city has approved everything, looked at everything, was happy with everything. Now they just got to work it through the process, and that hasn't been quick. So there's room on your prayer request at the bottom. Put there, hurry up city, in Jesus' name. Do that a lot. We're going to continue tonight in our in-depth study through the book of Genesis. We're going to join Jacob. Jacob is in his developing a testimony years. I have a friend in Hawaii whose son has been in lots of trouble over the years. And I always say to him, how's your boy doing? And he always used to say to me, well, he's still working on his testimony. And I guess that fits pretty well for Jacob because we've been with Jacob since he was born, along with his brother Esau back in chapter 25. His mom and dad, Isaac and Rebekah, spent 20 years praying for them to be born. They couldn't have children, then had the two at the same time. As the Lord began to speak to Rebekah during her pregnancy, having twins and all, the Lord told her about two nations in her womb and that the older would serve the younger. And so God, as he oftentimes did, as he directs the lives of his people, chose to bless the second-born as opposed to the firstborn because in his sovereignty he knew what he wanted, and he would have it that way. There is little told us in the scriptures of the formative years of the boys. We do know that their dispositions were, Esau was a rugged kind of outdoor hunter kind of guy. Jacob was a very indoor mama's boy, kind of cooking, poetry kind of guy. And there was tremendous favoritism in the family. So it wasn't their dispositions that were the problem as much as it was the parents' response. Dad loved Esau and his manly behavior. Mom loved her son Jacob and his, ability to cook and all. And it would bring tremendous suffering to the family. We were told at the end of chapter 25 that Jacob found Esau one night coming in hungry, not having done well hunting, and Jacob was cooking some bean stew or something, and he said, if I could just have some of that, I'm starving. And Jacob said, I'll give it to you for your birthright. Now, God had promised Jacob the birthright. He had a plan, but Jacob, like Jacob we will find him doing for many years until the Lord kind of brings him to his knees, was he always tried to cleverly get what he wanted. Even when God had promised it to him, he would go out of his way to try to manipulate and kind of work it out for himself. But even at that young age, Jacob valued that position. And not just the income that it would bring, but in his heart in many ways, the things that God would bring to him as a result. We looked in chapter 27 at some of the lessons we could learn from this very dysfunctional family of Isaac's. Isaac's the unspiritual father who, thinking he was going to die, decided he would bless Esau one time kind of on the sly, on the quiet. I'll just give you that blessing that I know you want to have and I want you to have, and forget about what God wants. And he wasn't going to die, but he thought he was. So he's about to really disobey God. Then there's Rebekah, his wife, who was eavesdropping to the conversation. She was unsurrendered to her husband, unsurrendered to the Lord, and said to Jacob, hey, we got to do something about this. Your dad's about to violate the will of God. We've got to make sure that the will of God stays in place. And so we'll lie and cheat and deceive, and that's what she did. She made food for Jacob to give to Dad as Esau made. She dressed him up in Esau's funky-smelling clothes. She put hair on his arms, and the goat hair on his neck. And they fooled Dad, who was blind, and he was pretty sure it was a trick, but he wasn't sure, so he went ahead with it. And anyway, they got the blessing out of old Isaac, and then Esau comes in, and Isaac realizes, man, I have tried to offend God, and he understood for himself. The Lord is going to have his way no matter what. I can either go along with him and be blessed or fight him and lose in the process. But God's ways won't be turned. And so, Jacob, who was willingly participating in this deception, was not so much worried about what he was doing wrong as much as he didn't want anybody to catch him and think that he was a deceiver. Esau, he just didn't care. He just wanted the stuff. And not getting the blessing from his dad, Esau turned and he married a bunch of heathen women and really broke his mom and dad's heart and all. Well, after the whole charade is over, Jacob hears from Esau, as soon as Dad's dead, you're dead. And Mom said, oh, that isn't going to be good. I'll send you to my family way over there in Haran, 500 miles away. I'll send you to them. And it'll just be for a little while. Oh, your brother's a hothead. He'll cool down. Well, Jacob would leave, and for 20 years he would be gone. And Rebekah, his mom, who loved him, would die. And his father, who thought he was going to die, would still be alive later on, years later, when he came back. But in any event, Jacob is sent by the Lord, though Mom, again, wants to have a hand in it. And he is sent to a place where his mom had grown up. And Jacob begins to learn about the grace and the knowledge of God. It is a slow growth process for Jacob. He spends the first night in a place called Luz. He can't sleep. He's been running all day. He covered 40 miles. He's just exhausted. He grabs a rock. He goes to sleep. The Lord shows himself to Jacob. He meets with God. He sees this ladder ascending and descending, and the Lord's involvement in a place that Jacob thought, certainly God can't be here. Jacob discovered that God was there, and he woke up. He said, I'm going to call this place the house of God, Bethel. And the Lord gave him promises there when he met with him. He talked to him about the provision of the land that he had promised Abraham and Isaac. He talked to him about the promise of his presence with him, that he wouldn't leave him. And he promised a protection to him. I'll bring you back here. And Jacob said, if you'll do all that, I will give you a tenth of all I possess. And it was this commemoration that Jacob, he set up a stone, he poured oil on it, he promised to give to the Lord, to walk in his grace. And off Jacob went to Laban's house in chapter 29, where he discovers that there are other crooked people in the world besides himself and his family. Because Laban, an uncle, is about as bad as they get. And between the two of them, treachery and deceit and trickery run in the family. This would make a great situation comedy, you know. These guys, nobody can be trusted. And Laban has two daughters. One's beautiful. Her name's Rachel. And Jacob immediately sees her and goes, oh, that's a beautiful woman right there. And then Leah, who not so pretty, not so desirable necessarily. But he immediately, as he works a month, and the uncle says, well, what do you want to stay and work? I'd like to pay. And he says, I'd like to work for your daughter's hand, Rachel. She's beautiful. I'd love to have her to be my wife. He said, well, that'd be fine. That'd be 7 years of labor. And he went, no problem. So it was a day, it says. He was just in love with this woman. For 7 years he worked, and they had the wedding. And he wakes up in his bedchamber on the night of his wedding, and he rolls over, and it isn't Rachel. It's less than attractive Leah. And Jacob went, oh, you got to be kidding me. How can you mess this up? And he run to the father and said, hey, time out. We got a deal here, you know. And Laban said, yeah, but the custom of our people is that you marry the oldest one first. And Jacob, the guy who had tried to steal the blessings of the firstborn, now is faced with the practice of the firstborn and the practices that the culture practiced. And so, well, what about Rachel? Well, you can have her as well, but you're going to have to work 7 more years. And so he did with great joy, and he got both of these wives, and he didn't love Leah. He loved Rachel. He didn't treat Leah good. He treated Rachel good. And again, that dysfunction just kind of continued from one generation to the next. We ended last week in chapter 29, beginning there, I think, in verse 31 down through the end, that as the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, verse 31 says, that he then opened her womb while Rachel was unable to have children, and in quick succession, the Lord gave to Leah 4 sons. And we read about them there last week as we went through. Reuben, firstborn, God sees. Simeon, the secondborn, God hears. And every time Leah was saying, I know my husband's going to love me now, I'm giving him sons. God sees my dilemma, Reuben. God hears my cry, Simeon. God has joined us together, Levi. And finally, she gave up on the children being the cause of her husband's love, and she called the fourth-born boy Judah to worship or to praise. Tonight in chapter 30, we would like to continue the story of Jacob and Laban, Rachel and Leah. We want to throw into the mix both of their handmaidens, Bilhah and Zilpah. And here's the lesson, in case you have to go early. This continual dysfunction, and it will continue on for many years to come, that surrounds Jacob and his family, will not restrict the work of God. And I want to just emphasize that to you, because so often as Christians we have families that aren't exactly normal, right? I mean, there's just a lot of stuff, and you want to pull out your hair saying, God, what are you doing? How can you work in this situation? God can always work. In fact, God's ways will never be restricted by the foolishness of the people that he needs to use. The benefit for us is, if you'll line up with the will of God and seek him, you'll get to enjoy watching God work. You'll get to be a part of it. You'll get to be thrilled by it and thankful for it and blessed through it. If you don't, and you follow a lot of what you read here, God will still accomplish what he wants, but you'll be miserable. You'll be miserable. You'll be struggling and striving and complaining and griping and trying to be underhanded, and there's favoritism and hatefulness, and competition. God still, at the other end of the pipe, the water of God still comes out, right? He still has his way. So you get to stand in one of two places, with the Lord or on your own. Now God will still have his way, so understand that in the end, nothing changes. What changes is how you respond and walk and work with the things of God, how you accept them, how you submit to him, how you let him work without trying to help him out, or not. And, we pray, our Father who art in heaven, thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. Now, ultimately, that's a prayer for the Lord to come, because it won't be like that till he comes, right? And then it'll be the same. But it can be that way in our life if we will submit to him. So it is better we seek the Lord and let him work than try to fall in with the world and work like the world to get what we want, even if we think we're doing it for the Lord. I'll be a little liar for the Lord. I'll be a little deceiver for the Lord. I'll be a little less than honest for the Lord. I'll steal so I can use the money to give it to the Lord. Foolishness. You can't do any of those things. God will work, and we'll just have to submit. So tonight we continue with Jacob, who might have been a good chef, and he might have been a good con artist. He's not much of a husband. He's not much of a father. And the reason is he's not much walking with God yet. And as those things get better, as he grows in the grace of God, we will find him being much more concerned with others than he is for himself. So anyway, chapter 30, verse 1. We still have a little time, don't we? Good. Wanted to get you up to speed. Now, when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister. She said to Jacob, "You give me children, or else I will die." And Jacob's anger was aroused against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" Now, I suspect that all of her life, Leah had to live in the shadow of her younger and more beautiful sister. But here she was, for the first time in her life, dominating the matriarchal portion of the home. She's given Jacob 4 healthy, beautiful, wonderful boys because God saw that she was unloved. And she was hoping that every child would make her home life, her married life better, and it had not. But she was in a position for the first time, though she wanted to be loved, she was in a position where her sister, for the first time, felt competitive with her older sister. And so, though Jacob showed great favoritism to Rachel, God showed great blessing to the household and given Leah children. So what does Rachel do? For the first time in her life, she's screaming bloody murder, no fair. Every one of us needs to be loved and wanted and appreciated. Certainly in a marriage, a woman's greatest desire is to have the love of her husband. That brings her more security than anything you might buy or seek to give to her. That's the most important thing. You guys could never tell your wives enough that you love them. Never enough. Same thing with kids. You can buy kids a lot of stuff, but they don't want that. What they want is your love, right? What they want is to be approved by their parents. They want acceptance. And we several years ago, I had a bunch of our kids in the Sunday school write letters to the Lord asking for things for their home. And one of that I kept and I still have was a 4th grader who wrote on his paper, "Please pray that my dad would love me." So it becomes a big issue. Now, it is an issue here too, because what Leah longed for from her husband was Jacob's love. She didn't get it. What Rachel longed for from her husband was preeminence, and she couldn't give to him the things that she believed she needed to give to him. And she was probably slighted for the first time in her life because she was absolutely the one who always seemed to get the first place in everything. And so Leah, with 4 children, is still struggling to win the love of her husband. And Rachel is threatened, if you will, by the whole thing. And she says to Jacob, "Give me some kids." And Jacob gets mad. And he really says, "That's God's deal. I can't help you with that. He's in charge of you having children, not me." Leah had the blessings from God, the blessings of a woman in a marriage, childbearing. And her first move, Rachel, was to blame Jacob. And Jacob says, "Look, I'm not God. I think everything's okay with me, by the way. I have 4 sons. The problem's with you. and God. Nice home to belong to. So Rachel comes up with a plan, verse 3. She says, well, here is my maid, the servant that she received from her father when she got married. Her name is Bilhah. Go in to her. She will bear a child on my knees, that I also may have children by her. So Rachel comes up with a plot that technically would allow her to own or claim as her own these children born to her servant Bilhah. The term there, a child on my knee, is a reference to the possession laws that were in force in that part of the country during the days of Jacob. In fact, 800 years or so before Moses came upon the scene, there was a man whose name was Hammurabi. And you might have heard of the Codes of Hammurabi, where he codified the laws of governing the ancient Near East from the Persian Gulf to the Caspian Sea and from the Euphrates all the way to the Mediterranean. And literally every tribe and people lived by the Code of Hammurabi early on. The Code of Hammurabi stated that if a wife was infertile, that a maid could bear children through her maid and that they would belong to the wife. So that was the practice that Rachel thought she could employ and kind of catch up with her sister, who she now felt a great competition with. That was the SOP. That was standard operating procedures for the culture. Everyone was doing it. Abraham and Sarah, you remember, did the same thing. You know, I can't have children. I'm getting older, so maybe you can go and take my servant, you know, and have children with her. Same principle. So Jacob, we can do that. You know, your grandfather Abraham did that, and Ishmael was married. You remember, you liked Ishmael, all right? You know, that would be good. So that's her plan. You give me kids, not me to do, it's God to do. Well, all right, then here, take my servant. Now, this is the typical lesson, and I would point this out to you just because we know, and you shouldn't forget that the larger picture is God gets his way no matter what, right? But this becomes one of those biblical examples of conforming your character to the behavior of the world around you to seek to get what you want and then say, well, everybody's doing it, or the world says it's okay, or this is the way that the Lord worked. It isn't something that God prescribed. It isn't something that he counseled. It isn't something that the Bible teaches. It was a tremendous difficulty for Abraham, and it was sinful. It certainly isn't any less sinful here. But here's a mixed up family, you know, that God is working in, but not everyone's listening yet. And so they fall back to, well, everyone's doing that. And when Paul writes to the Romans in chapter 12 years later, he says, now look, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind so that you can prove what is that good and perfect and acceptable will of God. Or in other words, look, there's a way the world will always sign off on that the church can argue, well, you know, the world's doing it, but you don't want that to be the litmus test for your life, you know? Just because the world's doing it, you know, my mother used to say, and if everybody jumped off the bridge, you know, the parental argument, would you jump off the bridge? And you go, well, probably I would, Mom, if they're all going, you know. That whole thing. All right, same thing with us. There's that verse in Exodus 23, verse 2 that says, don't follow a crowd to do evil. In other words, just because you have a majority doesn't mean you're right. Right? So be careful that we don't follow the customs of the world. And that's exactly what she does here. She agrees that this is the way that it should go. It was a huge mistake, I think, for her to settle for something so low. Had she just said, Lord, I'm available, use me, and eventually when she prays that prayer, she has children. You know, it wasn't as much an issue of God's inability as much as her unwillingness to submit herself to the Lord, and seeing her only interest wasn't to please God. It was to compete with her sister, you know, who she'd never been put out for by anyone or anything. And now she felt totally put out. So God superimposes his will. And I guess I want you to see that even when man sins, that's not his prescribed method of working. And you can look at the end and say, well, it all worked out. Well, yeah, it all worked out because God won't let things get away. But it didn't all work out for her. And it didn't all work out for the family. And that's the issue, right? We have to be where God is. So, yes, they'll end up with 12 children. There'll be 12 tribes of Israel. But don't think for a minute that that's the prescribed method because that's the way they took. It isn't, and it wasn't. God would have gotten 12 kids. God would have been just fine with bringing 12. He has no problem with children. I'm sure of it. All right, verse 4. Then she gives Bilhah, her maid, to him as a wife. Jacob takes her officially as his wife. And Jacob went into her, and Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. And Rachel said, well, God has judged my case. In other words, I knew I did the right thing. And he has also heard my voice and given me a son. So she called his name Dan. And Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again, bore Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, well, with great wrestling, I have wrestled with my sister, and indeed I have prevailed. Isn't this wonderful? Now we're having more kids than her. We're catching up. And she called his name Naphtali. So I want you to notice what her sister, what Rachel is saying in the names of her children. God has defended my cause, right? God has heard my prayer and judged my case. He has given me a son. And then I'm wrestling with my sister and I'm winning, or I'm catching up. In other words, this is the will of God. This is the way of God. These are the things of God. And she looks around and she names her kids that. What a weirdo family this is, don't you think? Dan means judge. Rachel names him believing God had vindicated her. Danielle means God is my judge. Yet all of this effort on Rachel's part is not driven by a love for the Lord, by a devotion to her husband. It is all about jealousy and envy and competition. This is a screwed up family. Totally messed up, dysfunctional from day one. And yet God still has his way. I like that. And you should like it too. Now, she is pleased with her success. She promotes more relationships with this woman, this servant maid. And number 6 is born, and Naphtali means to wrestle. Now, Rachel names him, for she now sees this whole issue as a wrestling match with her sister, and she begins to think, I'm catching up. This is pretty pathetic, don't you think? This is a sad state of affairs. Well, as you might suspect, verse 9, when Leah saw that she no longer was bearing children, she took Zilpah, her maid, and she came to Jacob, and she said, you know, it worked out pretty well. I'd like to present to you your new wife, my maid. And Leah made Zilpah bear Jacob, and Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son. And Leah said, a troop comes. I got 5 now, buddy. Here comes a whole army of kids. So she calls his name Troop, or Gad. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob another son. And Leah said, I'm so happy, but the daughters will now call me blessed. And so she called his name Asher. So 2 can play at this game. I got a servant when I got married, Zilpah too. She's a young girl. I can offer her to Jacob. And Jacob quickly is the father of 2 more kids. One called the Troop, because now Leah has 5 kids to her credit, her and her team. And then Asher, happy, for God made me happy again before my friends. I now have brought 6 men into the world. Team Leah, 6. Team Rachel, 2. Now, this is a sad picture, isn't it? And Leah wants only one thing. She doesn't want 20 kids. She wants her husband to love her. But she also has a competition with her sister. So she has all of these mixed motives going on, you know. Her husband afforded her little love. Rachel, you know, was always first in everything. The princess always came first. And then add to that whole cultural understanding that a lot of kids meant God's blessing regardless of how they came to you. That's how they were interpreted. It was off, even if it happened from time to time because the Lord had good timing. That couldn't be equated. There weren't enough examples of that, nor practice of that, to say not having children means God's angry or God's judging me. God used it from time to time, but when he did, it was made very clear to the people living in sin. When it wasn't so clear, you couldn't draw that conclusion. So God worked despite the players. And I guess I want to drive that home to you because this is such a mixed up story, and it's going to get worse when we get to chapter 34. You're going to say, what in the world is going on here? God works through the dumbest, the slowest, the weakest. He works through us, pretty much. Right? And we want to be sure that we are, Lord, have your way, and we're submitted to him so that we don't fall for, well, the whole world's doing it, and it's legal, and it's acceptable, and it's politically correct. If it's wrong, it's wrong. If it's right, it's right. If God's in it, he's in it. If God's not, don't get involved with it. Because in the end, the same conclusion will come. But you'll either be blessed or judged because of it. So, what a mixed up family. Verse 14. Now, Reuben, and Reuben was Leah's oldest, who might have been at least 9 years old now, maybe even older. Reuben went in the days of the wheat harvest, and he found some mandrakes in the field, and he brought them home to his mother Leah, and Rachel saw them and said to Leah, "Could you give me some of your son's mandrakes?" But she said to her, "Is it a small matter that you've taken away my husband, and now you want to take away my son's mandrakes also?" And Rachel said, "Well, I'll let you sleep with them tonight if you give me some of those mandrakes." I know. And when Jacob came out of the field that evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, "You're mine tonight. I've hired you as my son's mandrakes," and he lay with her that night. I know. Mandrakes were in the culture viewed as powerful aphrodisiac. In fact, they were called love apples. Fact or fiction? Absolute fiction. Right? This was persuasion within the culture. It was absolute foolishness. From verse 9 and what follows, it appears that Jacob might very well have stopped having any intimate relationships with Leah at all now that her fertility time seems to have passed. That's certainly the accusation from Leah to Rachel in this regard. And notice that the offer from Rachel is, "I'll send them your way tonight. I just want those mandrakes." So she was in that power position again with Jacob. That love was certainly completely gone. And so she resorts to this perennial fruit that I suspect she believed would heighten sexual appetite. I think that she had her son go get these for her and fully expected to somehow use them to entice Jacob to be more interested in her. I think Rachel believed the same thing, when I got to have them things because I'm kind of losing my grip as well, and there's 4 wives. Now you can just, what a mess is this? And so here's that competition that just keeps working itself out, if you will. And Rachel asks for some, and Leah basically says, "Well, what else do you want? You've stolen my husband. Now you're going to steal the mandrakes I brought, and so they made the deal." Well, notice from verse 16 that night Leah was waiting for Jacob to arrive from work, arrive from the field, and she meets him with the details, and Jacob goes along without complaining. Okay. He's kind of a passive guy. I don't know, maybe he's thrilled by women fighting over him. I don't know. He's not a young, he's in his 80s, but I don't know. Maybe his ego was inflated. I don't know. But I read it and I feel so bad for Leah. She only wants to be loved. She really just wants her husband to love her. And there was no security for her. And how sad that she has to bargain with Rachel, who knows very well how much she's suffering. These are pretty mean-spirited women. Well, Leah sleeps again with her husband, hoping the old wives' tale of the mandrakes can bring her another child. But here's the sadness. When you turn from faith and you begin to look to worldly methods to get what you want because you don't believe God is listening to your prayers, you're in a bad position. If you give up on God and you start reaching for the world's ways, whatever they are, I'm going to hang on to these things now. I'm going to trust in these things now. And like Abraham and Sarah and so many others, when God doesn't do as we ask, when we ask, we then do it ourselves only to turn around and say, "Well, the Lord was good." Really? Is that true? That's a lie to ourselves. God had nothing to do with this. So I look at the language of verse 16. "I've hired you with the mandrakes." And if your marriage is reduced to this, that's pretty sad news. I've made a deal. Yet, as you continue to read what Moses writes, I think the Lord wants you to know it was prayer and not the mandrakes that responded to another child in Leah's life. Because we read in verse 17, "And God listened to Leah." It isn't God moved because of the mandrakes. God saw that the potion was in order. No, he listened to the cry of this poor woman's heart, even as he had moved upon her to begin with, back in verse 31, when he saw that Leah was unloved. He knows her heart. And though she is reaching in a lot of places, God listens to her cry, and he gives to her a 5th son that night. And Leah said, "God has given me my wages because I have given my maid to my husband." And so she called his name Issachar. Wages. God is paying me back for loaning Zilpah to the effort, she believed. It is as confusing as it can get, isn't it? And old Jacob's in the middle, the patriarch, our fearless leader. "Bought you with the mandrakes, coming right away, dear." I don't know. You just want to wake him up, don't you, a little bit? No leadership at all, no spiritual sense whatsoever. But he had met with God. God had gone, I'll bring you back. I'll watch over you. The Lord puts up with a lot with us, doesn't he? Verse 19, and Leah conceived again, and Jacob now had a sixth son, and Leah said, God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will dwell with me because I've borne him 6 sons. And so she named him Zebulun, which means dwelling. She just believed that number 6 would surely now persuade Jacob to come home. Ugly polygamy, isn't it? Dysfunctional family. Oh, I've given him 6 boys. Verse 21 tells us, then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened... verse 21. And afterwards, for Leah, she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah, which means to judge. And Leah was through. It was difficult to be born a woman in these days. History is filled with stories of how when babies were to be born, that the whole neighborhood came to celebrate with food and parties to be had and wine to drink, and then they heard it was a girl and everybody went home. Oh, yeah, sorry. You couldn't really be too excited. So what a terrible deal. So in the competition, it's Leah's 6 kids born to her. Rachel's had 0, right? None whatsoever. Well, then we get to verse 22. And we read, then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her, and he opened her womb. Again, it wasn't the mandrakes. It was the cry of Rachel turning now to the Lord. And so she conceived, and she bore a son. And she said, God has taken away my reproach. At least there's a little better reasoning for prayer here. She felt like she needed to come to the place where God would bless her. And so she bore a son. She called his name Joseph and said, the Lord shall add to me another son. And the word Joseph, that's what the name means. He will add. And she believed that God would bless. She was right. We won't read about it tonight, but in chapter 35, she will give birth to her final son, Jacob's 12th son, Benjamin. It means son of my right hand. And she would die giving birth in the process near Bethlehem. We're going to spend a lot of time with Joseph, her 12th, this 12th son to be born, beginning in chapter 35, almost to the end of the book, really, the life and the ministry of Joseph. Actually, it doesn't start in chapter 35, chapter 39, I guess, through chapter 50 will be the life of Joseph. So here we have the birth of the 11 sons, 1 daughter, to 4 wives, with 1 son yet to be born, all over this 14-year period that Jacob has earned 1 wife and has paid for, if you will, the other. But what a family, don't you think? And you read through these things, and they never resolve any conflict year after year after year. This is just one goofed up bunch of people, right? They're fighting with each other. Oh, God's blessing me, not you. They're reaching for worldly pleasures and worldly affairs and worldly effects to try to get a jump on things. They're naming kids after their victories. We're wrestling now. You're called wrestling because we're wrestling now. God is judging me because God is on my side. Can you imagine this going on? And Jacob just, no wonder he's quiet maybe. I don't know. But I thought about this because, we do a lot of marriage counseling here and family counseling, and you find that there are families that never deal with conflict. It all gets brushed under the carpet, for year after year after year. Nobody says anything. Nobody wants to talk about it. Cold shoulders are the way to go, Other folks, they store it up and they simmer, and then one day they make an appointment and they blow up. And when they blow up, everything around them kind of blows up. There's casualties all around, Some people use their kids as weapons, like these moms did in naming their children like that, like the 2 girls did here. You see it in divorce all the time. Husband and wife can't get to each other, but they can still torture each other through their children. So mom will tell the little boy what a jerker his dad is, tell me what dad's doing. And the kid's just like in the middle. He's not loved anymore. He now becomes part of the competition, Others turn from each other to their children, and they spend their entire lives taking care of their kids, and their kids move out, and they end up divorced. And the reason is simple. They've never loved each other, but they've used it, they've turned their affections and their interest to somebody else, and when the empty nest comes, there's nothing to sustain the couple. If nothing else, learn from them by just the narrative of the story that there's a better way to go, and that is to work it out, face up to it, talk it through, get help if needed. You don't want to leave it festering and ignore it completely, But the issue comes down to, as Christians, we got to submit our life to the Lord, right? He doesn't need your help. He wants your faithfulness. He doesn't need your suggestions. He will never in his life, as God, say, I wonder what Jack's thinking. I wonder if he's got any ideas. Or you can put your own name in there. You just don't laugh at me. You'll be in the same boat. He doesn't want your help either. So it's all about submission to his will as opposed to, trying to connive my way ahead and then somehow try to give God credit, or I've been manipulative and sinful and wicked. Oh, thank the Lord. Look where I've gotten myself. Well, you can lie to yourself, but look what happened here. God, this is nothing new. This is as old as the book of Genesis. Well, beginning in verse 25 and then heading out to the end of the chapter, and we're going to make it in time, don't worry. We now turn from Jacob's home life to Jacob's work life, his labors. And notice in verse 25 that it came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph that Jacob said to Laban, I want you to send me away now that I might go to my own place and to my own country. I want you to give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and let me go, for you know my service which I have done for you. So Jacob, after 14 years of service, these two wives, and now 11 children, is ready to leave and head home. He fulfilled his obligation, and yet he's ready to leave. Now, and I like that because there is that heart that Jacob, he wants to go back home, right? And that's what the Lord had said to him. I'm going to bring you back here. So there's always that spiritual spark that you find burning in his heart. Sometimes it gets snuffed out pretty quick, but God's always doing something with Jacob. And it's taken a while, but he's going to get him to where he wants him to be. So don't be too discouraged with others. But here Jacob has worked 14 years, and he's ready to go home. But watch what happens. Because Laban says to him in verse 27, please stay. If I have found favor in your eyes, I've learned by my experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake. So name me your wages and I'll give it to you. Now, with all that Jacob wanted in his heart to go home, it only required this little word from Laban to change his direction. Because I think that Jacob thought to himself, I was here 7 years longer than I needed to be. You ripped me off. I have a wife I don't even like. They're always at each other's throats. Should have had 2 or 3 kids. I got 12 coming. Your fault. Now, I'm going to get even. I'll hang around for a while, but I'm going to take you for all that you're worth. So even though there's that heart deep down in there somewhere, oh, God, where's the Lord? My parents, my family, I got to go home. Yeah, stay. I realize God is blessing me because of you. Name your price. And Jacob goes, all right, I'll name my price. Thank you for bringing that up. And he believes it's now his turn to cash in on some of the benefits and the dividends of his hard work. Look, God's still dealing with his son, but more time is going to be needed. Interesting. It is cool to me how often we read of others being blessed because God's people are among them. And I think that's probably one of those lessons that you want to take to heart. You might be the only one at your job that's saved, and you wonder how come you're all there all by yourself. And Lord, bring other Christians, and you're just the only one. Well, God only needs you there, doesn't he? So I suspect that blessing comes to where you're working just because of you. God watches over you. He takes care of you. He blesses you. And people notice. We should be a blessing to people, shouldn't we? I'm always fearful when the world looks at Christians and go, those Christians. They may not like our policies, our politics, or our persuasions about God, or our lifestyles, but they should be blessed we're hanging around. Because God blesses his people. And you put us in the midst of a bunch of people in the world, they should at some point realize, hey, it's a good thing them Christians are here. There's peace when no one else peace. They have joy when everybody's upset. They're faithful. They're honest. They're dependable. Man, they're the best workers. They're the best friends. They're honorable. They'll stay with you. We ought to be a blessing. And go through the Bible sometime and look. Isaac was with Abimelech there in Gerar. Didn't even need to be there. Shouldn't have been there. And God blessed the whole area because Isaac was there. Joseph was with Potiphar in Egypt, and they gave him everything that he wanted because Potiphar was sure he was getting blessed because Joseph was there. When he was in prison, everyone was blessed. They went, it's because Joseph is here. Wherever you find the Christians going, through Abraham, all of the nations of the world will be blessed. Well, certainly that's going to come through Christ, but through Christ in you, so does that blessing come to others. So Laban saw it. Now let me make this clear for you. The word experience in verse 27, I've learned by experience. The word there is divination or enchantment. Laban was an idol worshiper. He wasn't interested in God or the God of Jacob. He was absolutely swallowed up in the culture from which God had pulled Abraham out of. This was old town for Abraham. This was old place for Rebekah. This is not the place that is talking about God Most High. But this is a man who is consumed with self and the world and worldly ways. He could care less about Jacob's God. But if there was blessing coming his way, he was a superstitious enough man to go, please stay. Because, it's like the old rabbit's foot. If I got it in my hand, I'll be all right, If I wear my lucky shirt, I can't lose. If I got my lucky nephew here, who brings me great divination blessing. He doesn't relate the blessings to the blessings of Almighty God. He relates it in his superstitious, idolatrous way, and yet Jacob had brought, obviously, the hand of God upon him. So, whatever you want. Now, here's what Jacob says, verse 29. You know that I have served you and how your livestock has been with you. For what you had before I came was just little, and now it has increased to a great amount. The Lord has blessed you since my coming. He turns it from divination to a person, to God. And now, when shall I also provide for my own house? When am I going to get to share in some of the rewards? That's his motivation for staying. You owe me. The Lord has blessed you, but you owe me. Interesting. So he said, well, what should I give you? And Jacob said, you shall give me nothing, or you shall not give me anything. If you will do this thing for me, I'll go again and feed and keep your flocks. Let me pass through all of your flocks today, and I will remove from there all of the speckled and the spotted sheep, all of the brown ones from the lambs, the spotted and speckled one from the goats, and these can be my wages. And so my righteousness will answer for me in a time to come when the subject of my wages comes before you, that everyone that is not speckled or spotted among the goats or brown among the lambs, it will be considered stolen if it's with me. And Laban says, oh, that it were according to your word. Translation, I wish I could trust you, because they didn't. And so Jacob, he removed that day the male goats that were speckled and spotted from the female goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had some white in it, and all of the brown ones among the lambs, and he gave them into the hands of his sons, and he put 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob fed then the rest of Laban's flocks. So Jacob's answer to, what can I pay you to stay? And Jacob says, I've been taking care of you. You have been blessed considerably, not by your stupid little idol, but by my God. So when am I going to get now the benefit? I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll stay. You don't have to pay me anything. Let's do this. Let's take out all of the blue ribbon, if you will, cattle and goats and lambs. Let me give to you all of the blue ribbon animals, all of the show winners. I'll take the marred ones, the speckled ones, the cheap ones, the one that doesn't look like much. Let me have them. And then anytime you want, you can come check. And if there's anything among my flocks that my boys will be watching that doesn't have spots on it, I've ripped you off, because those belong to you. But if they're all speckled, those are mine. Will that be a good deal? And here's Laban goes, I wonder what I'm not seeing here, right? Oh, that I could believe you. I'm not sure what's going on here. Very hesitant. But let's give it a try. Let's see what will happen. Now, the odds were low that Jacob would get many of the speckled, especially separated out, and so Laban thought he had won. Now here's where the interest comes in. Some believe that Jacob had become an experienced, breeder, if you will, that he was able to somehow do the kind of breeding that was necessary to breed out or to breed in qualities. So, because over these next 6 years, most of that blue ribbon flock turned out speckled and ended up on Jacob's side. In fact, 6 years from now, the boys, his boys, Laban's boys, would be so angry, they go, everything my dad owns is gone. Jacob's got all of it. And they started talking about, let's get Jacob. And Jacob saw that their countenance had changed. That's what we'll read here, that he saw the countenance had changed. And I think it's verse 2 of chapter 31. And he decides he better bail out of town after 20 years. But in any event, over the next 6 years, that whether it was breeding or like the mandrakes, it was just a weird superstition, hard to define biblically. The description or the explanation that you get from the Bible is that Jacob used superstitious practices. It has nothing to do with any kind of feeding or crossbreeding or temperature or anything that you might do to mix up or to mess with what you're going to get out of your breeding processes, at least not biblically. There's no explanation for that. So we presume, just from what we have in the Bible, that Jacob falls upon the very thing that everyone else did, superstitiously beginning to do things that people taught, but weren't necessarily, certainly weren't scientifically accurate, if you will. Whatever the cause, that's the way that it went. So we read in verse 37, "Now Jacob took for himself rods of green poplar from the almond and from the chestnut tree. He peeled white strips in them, and then he exposed the white in the rods, and the rods which he had peeled he then set before the flocks in the gutters, in the watering troughs where the flocks came to drink, so that they should conceive when they came to drink." Jacob got his sheep and cows having children like wildfire, while Laban's flocks just kind of began to die off. And so the flocks conceived before the rods, and the flocks brought forth streaked and speckled and spotted. And Jacob separated the lambs, made the flocks face towards the streaked, and then all the brown in the flock of Laban, but he put his own flocks by themselves, did not put them with Laban's flocks. And it came to pass, whenever the stronger livestock conceived, Jacob placed these rods before the eyes of the livestock in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. Now, I said there's no scientific, even to this day, explanation as to how that would work in a helpful manner at all. So, again, let me just say this to you. When you depend upon yourself, you may get what God wants, but you didn't get there trusting God. Does that make sense? I know I'm repeating myself, but it's a big lesson in these chapters. You'll get where God wants you to be, but you may not get there by faith. So, needless to say, verse 42, "When the flocks were feeble, he did not put them in, so the feebler were Laban's, the stronger were Jacob's. Thus the man became exceedingly prosperous, and now he had large flocks of female and male servants and camels and donkeys." Whatever the cause, in time Laban's sons saw their inheritance slipping away, and God would use this to move Jacob home. Later on, Jacob will look back to this time and say of the Lord, "God was with me, his hand was upon me, he made me rich." Right now in chapter 30, Jacob would say, "I'm pretty good at what I do. I strip the bark off, I throw it in the water, and everybody goes my way. I'm a good guy. You just let me mess with stuff, I'll get it." A couple of chapters from now, he's going to say, looking back as he's standing before God, "I know that the Lord blessed me. I know that the Lord was with me, that it wasn't what I was doing." Just like those mandrakes. That didn't help me either. It was prayer. It was seeking the Lord. So, in any event, this takes us 6 years forward. 20 years in, Jacob is now 97 years old. And he is ready to do something that Jacob has always done. He runs when times get tough. His brother wanted to kill him, he ran. The boys now want to kill him. He's going to run. He's going to leave at night. He's going to leave when his father and their boys are days away, farming or taking the flocks to feed. And he's going to run off. He's going to have a confrontation with his father-in-law, who's going to come running after him. He's going to get cut off from heading back to that direction. He is going to hear that Esau is coming out to meet him with 400 of his best friends. And Jacob's going to get stuck between, a rock and a hard place, so to speak. And he's going to be brought to a place where he has to surrender his life to the Lord. But the lesson I want you to leave with tonight is that God's persistent work in our lives will bring us where he wants us to be, and we can either go willingly or live in sin. The fallout is, if you live in sin, you have all of these problems and hurts and broken hearts, and you don't have much fruit. The good news is if you line up with what God wants, even though you don't see a way that he's going to be able to pull it off. You can't begin to figure out, how am I going to get to there when all of these people are in the way? I hear it all the time. People say, well, my wife or my family or my parents or my kids, and they always blame someone. Oh, I would serve the Lord if it wasn't for, and then they have a name for you or a situation for you or circumstance. That's an invalid complaint. God will have his way. You can wait upon him. What you don't need to do is help him or sin in the process to accomplish his will. Doesn't work that way. God will get you from A to B, and B will always be the same. You'll get to B, and Jacob will too. But man, he has made such a mess of things, and unfortunately the fallout for it in the next 4 or 5 chapters is sad. And even when he meets the Lord and God changes his name to, you are governed by God, you're going to be called Israel now, blessed. Jacob no sooner turns around, he goes right back to being Jacob. He has this great spiritual experience in the desert. God's with me, man. He can't walk anymore. God's made him limp. You know, he's took away the one thing Jacob always depended on, running. He couldn't run. Now he's limping. I just love God now. I'm called Israel. Don't call me Jacob anymore. I'm not a heel catcher. I'm not living by my own ways. I'm a man governed by God. Last 5 verses. And he's just absolutely back in the trouble spot again. Doesn't go where God wants him to. Great difficulty in his family, murder, rape. It's horrible. And then he finally, in chapter 35, gets to where God wants him to be. So don't lose the lesson. The big picture is important. I know the parts of the story you go, oh my goodness, did you read the story? But don't lose the big lesson, right? God's persistent work in your life will bring you to where he wants you to be. You can either go willfully or sinfully. The choice is yours, and the fruit will be the consequence of your choice, because God's going anyway. All right? Father, thank you tonight for your word to us, and it is certainly an important lesson that we don't oftentimes think of, or maybe we don't oftentimes consider, that certainly worldly ways and God's oversight both come together here in these stories from Jacob's life. And Lord, your ways haven't failed, your plans were accomplished, your will was never frustrated, and yet through those in whom you sought to work, they suffered greatly because they weren't willing always to surrender to you. They relied upon worldly wisdom and deceptive tactics and plots made in the darkness and dependence upon worldly ways and even just full-on superstition. Does that frustrate your plans? Of course it doesn't. Does it frustrate you? I suspect, Lord, it does. That we aren't willing to let you both give us the direction and then bring it to pass. But help us to do just that tonight as we look to you. We know your will and your heart. May we wait for you to work. May we step out only when you say go. And may we not get ahead of you or try to help you or somehow make excuses, Lord. Because the Lord didn't do it. I had to do something. We don't. May we learn that from Jacob and from his family tonight. And I would say to you tonight, if you're here, if that's your story, if this stuff hits way too close to home, then maybe this is a good time to just pull back from all of your, I'm going to help God out ideas, and stop and just begin to pray that God would show you the path that you should take and let him be the Lord. Doesn't mean we shouldn't speak up or speak out from time to time. God knows. But we'll never need to sin to get to where God wants us to be. Nor will anyone be able to keep us from what God has planned. So it is such a dangerous, work of the enemy to try to get you to do the things that you see in Jacob's life or the wives' lives and the competition and all. Oh God, help us. May the Lord lift you up. May God raise you up. May the Lord go before you and open a door that no man can shut. You may feel like, I deserve the raise. I deserve the promotion. I deserve to be moved forward. And maybe you do. But look, if God has got a job for you down that line, then he'll get you there. And no one, not one crooked boss, no lying employee, no deceitful group of people will keep you from what God has intended for you. But you want to arrive there in that position one day, thanking the Lord that you've kept your hands off of it and you've trusted him. That's it. And in all those types of situations, may the Lord help you to just get your hands off of his work and be blessed as you walk with him. The pastors are up front, many of them, they'd love to pray with you tonight if that's been a problem for you. That you can leave it with God. Lord, I want to leave this with you tonight. Not anymore am I going to try to do this, because you know God's going to have his way. God's going to have his way every time. So you come, and may the Lord bless you as you do. And if you don't know Jesus tonight and you want to know what it means to be saved, then you come up and ask one of these guys, hey, I need to know the Lord better. How do I get saved? And they'll be glad to show you and to share with you God's plan. Shall we stand?